Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives.
Ale weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror movie and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today says he didn't do it. He swears he didn't do it. Welcome, Darrell Buxton. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Andrew. Really looking forward to today's session, and hopefully we're going to have a lot of fun with this.
Yeah, thanks for coming back on. It's really nice to see you. What you been up to?
Well, I've been doing my work on We Belong Dead as usual, editing that. We've just got a new issue out, issue 39. We're preparing issue 40, which is going to be a Dracula special. We've got all kinds of great stuff in there. We've got some pretty big name interviews for that, and a lot of interesting articles. And what we're looking at in the Dracula issue is we're sort of ignoring the Christopher Lee, Lugosi angle. There's some of that we'll drift into it, but we're trying to cover some of those corners of Dracula and vampire fiction and vampire films that are sort of less travelled, you know, and do a sort of a bit of an alternative look at Dracula as a film and TV character. So hopefully that's going to be an interesting issue. Doing bits and pieces elsewhere. I've got a couple of festivals coming up where I'm going to be doing interviews and things. And I've been doing a bit of work for the Blu-ray label Treasured Films recently as well. And in fact, I actually worked for a couple of months commuting to their offices outside Birmingham. So that was a long haul every day, a sort of 6-hour round trip to do like an 8-hour day. But it was fabulous working there with Graham and Tom. And I'm now in the modern parlance, I guess I'm now working from home for them. So I'm still in touch with the Treasured Films. They've got a really good roster of Blu-rays during the rest of 2024. And any help they need from me, I'll be happy to sort of chip in and help out with things like extras and booklet essays and things like that. So all looking good there, and it's nice to have a new boutique label. You can't have enough of them, and it's great to see a new one spring up and have such a collection of interesting releases on the way. So yeah, I'm busy as ever, really.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking there about Dracula. I mean, obviously there's the new Nosferatu film on the horizon, which, you know, anything from Eggers is always going to be interesting, I think. But but aside from that, it'd be interesting to see the issue and how you've tackled that, because I think, you know, is there anywhere else? I'm sure there will be more and more sort of adaptations, but do you think, is there anywhere else it can go? Is there anything else we can do with Dracula? I'm not talking about the vampire mythology as a whole, but just specifically that character.
Indeed. I mean, whenever people try and do something, if you look at the reaction to the infamous episode 3 of the Mark Gatiss adaptation from a couple of years ago, people seem to enjoy the gothic flavour of the first 2 parts of that, and especially the sort of shipboard episode 2. But then you get to the modern day episode, which seemed to suggest they were going to launch a Sherlock type series, which has never materialised and never developed. But that looked as though it was going to be the idea, with episode 3 of that incarnation of Dracula looking towards the future, and fans hated it. And so even if you want to try and do something with the character, I think there's this natural resistance from people. They want this particular type of Dracula, and they want it to stay gothic. They want it to be a la Stoker or a la the movies that they've grown up with, Nosferatu, the Todd Browning, Lugosi film, the Hammer films. And there are a lot of fans that don't want to deviate from that. So it's difficult to do something with Dracula. I think it can be done successfully, but maybe not. I think the thing to do is not aim it at that core audience. Like I love the Hotel Transylvania films, the animated movies, and with Adam Sandler of all people as Dracula, and their portrayal of the character and their use of him sort of harks back to things like the Count on Sesame Street and things like that. They have a bit of fun with Count Dracula, and but it's not aimed at people that necessarily know the background to the character. You know, everybody's heard of Count Dracula, but kids being taken by their mums and dads to see Hotel Transylvania, you know, part whatever we're up to now, are just loving the whole sort of vibe of those movies and having a bit of a laugh and a joke with the vampire mythos. And I love that. I love that you can bring these characters to a new audience, have a bit of fun with them, but still stay sort of true to their roots, you know, and still it's having a laugh with the characters, not at them, sort of thing. So there's one way that you can do something new. I'm sure there are others, and I think there have been others in the past as well. And hopefully, our issue of We Belong Dead is going to touch on some of those. We're going to be running an article, indeed, on TV comedy sketches from Britain and all around the world that featured Dracula. There were a lot of those in the 70s, even adverts and things like that. And we found some fairly surprising names that played Dracula in comedy sketches, people that you wouldn't believe. So, but it's not all about the comedy angle. It's about doing other stuff with the character. There was the great Guy Maddin film, Dracula, Pages from a Virgin's Diary, which restaged the film in typical Maddin fashion. He made it as a silent film, as he does with a lot of his movies. And it was like the silent Dracula that we never had, you know. It was almost like, oh, somebody's filmed Dracula in 1927, except it wasn't. It was decades later, you know. And they cast a Chinese actor as Dracula, which is always interesting when that's done. Even Hammer did that, of course, in Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. And it's always interesting when people shift the character radically like that. And Maddin's film was staged, because it was done silent, it was sort of staged as a ballet. With music very heavy on the soundtrack, and it was a fascinating way to take on Dracula, and again another sort of incarnation that showed that there is scope for doing something different with this character. You, again, always staying true to the roots, never diverging from the stuff that people know and the stuff that people want, but I think there is scope to add to it. And it's easy to get that wrong, but I think when it's done right, as in the examples I've just mentioned, I really think it's a success. And so, yeah, I can see what you mean. Dracula seems to be sort of rooted in certain areas, but yeah, with an imaginative filmmaker or an imaginative artist can sort of tweak this a little and push it into different directions.
Well, so, I mean, like you said, the Mark Gatiss fairly recent one, I quite enjoyed that. Even the much criticised episode 3, I liked it. I mean, I liked it a little. Part of me liked it because it gave me the opportunity to just wind fanboys up, because there was a lot of backlash. Oh, well, Dracula can't be bisexual. Why have they made him bisexual? It's like, what, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah.
He spent a century ripping people's throats out. You had no problem with that. Now he's bisexual. You got a problem with him.
Yeah, so how many vampire films have you guys seen? You know,
exactly. You know, as if vampires, it's not, the nature of it is not about seduction. What are you not fucking picking up from this? You know.
Yeah.
So I quite liked that, and I like the fact that Renfield was a blood sucking lawyer. You know, that's great. You know, all of that kind of stuff is nice, and I think a lot of the what are kind of deemed as being untouchable classics now were controversial in their day. You know, people didn't understand it. You know, something like the Coppola, you know, that got a lot of criticism back in the day, but a lot of people would absolutely defend that now, and quite rightly so. It's a lot of fun. It's a good campy sort of horror film with some serious stuff in there, but you know, it's almost like I liked it because it's almost like Hopkins was in a different film to Gary Oldman. But yeah, but I liked it, and yeah, and I had a lot of fondness for that when it came out. But yeah, so you can't please everybody, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't try to do that. That's pointless. Make the film you want to
Sure.
make. So yeah, and also I rewatched fairly recently, and I hadn't seen it. You know, shamefacedly, I had not seen this for about 40 years. The 1979 TV movie. I watched that
Mm.
again fairly recently, and God, it looks brilliant. It looks superb. It's beautifully done. Really enjoyed that watching that again.
Yeah, I think people are always cite that as being people are looking for authenticity and looking for something that's like the book. And of course, as people like Richard Matheson pointed out, you can't film the novel of Dracula because it's a
No,
series of letters and diary entries. So it'd be the most boring film ever. But I think what people regard as being authentic Dracula, I think that comes closer than any other production. It really does.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a nice segue, I guess, because I mean, this is a special episode of Tea for Terror. It's always special when you're on, Darrell, but it is a special episode because normally what we do, we talk about one specific film and we analyze that and pick that apart. But today we're going to look at a person, which we'll get to later on. But before we do that, I want to go into really the sort of landscape that this person sort of slotted into, really. And I want to talk about, first of all, talk about the idea of early British horror, because most of the time, if you talk about British horror, we tend to think of it being from the mid 50s onwards, and we tend to mark it with Hammer sort of, pardon the pun, but hammering the stake in and claiming that particular part, and fair enough. That's what Hammer did. Hammer was very much, if you think about British horror, that's where we naturally go to and gravitate to. And a lot of stuff, obviously, Amicus and other Tygon and companies like that. And there's obviously from the mid 50s, but there is this almost forgotten side of British horror. Even if you put aside things like, Dead of Night, which came out, sort of in the immediate post-war period, and almost kind of designed the template for the sort of Amicus films, which will come later. And, we talked about Dead of Night in another episode, so I don't want to get into that. But before that, I mean, I think this really interesting, and it's interesting in some ways because of the lack of horror, and partly that was due to the fact that you had little bit later on in the 30s, you had the introduction of the H for horror certificate, which, for those that don't know, it was, an early form of censorship in this country where you basically stuck a H for horror certificate on your film, and in theory, that meant people under 16 couldn't get in to see it. So that had a massive impact on films, but not just films in this country. So if you think about a studio like Universal in America, that was, for a while their stock in trade was horror films. Um, if they didn't have a decent market in the United Kingdom, then it's another sort of element which made them rethink whether they should carry on making horror films or not for a little while.
Look in a reference book, look through a reference book on vintage movies, and you'll suddenly arrive at 1937, 1938, and there are no American horror films, or none to speak of. There's a couple that maybe touch on the genre, but yeah, as you say, production completely stopped, and that shows the influence of the British audience there, and the sheer numbers and the money that they could make from exporting these films overseas. And suddenly the BBFC say, right, we're not going to touch this stuff anymore. We don't want this being imported into Britain. And not only do they have the power to do that, but as you say, it actually affects production in the United States. They're losing so much of a global audience because of that they say it's not worth our while making these films.
Yeah, and I think because I do like, I like yourself, you do a lot of stuff with Derby Quad Cinema in Derby, and I do a lot of stuff with Broadway Cinema in Nottingham. So I teach a lot of film courses and film awareness stuff, and I tend to lean on the sort of cult horror stuff. And I recently did a course called American Gothic, which was obviously looking at American horror films from the sort of the silent days onwards. But it was but my argument is that yes, the in terms of, obviously you had things like The Ghoul, and you had the Mystery of the Mary Celeste, where British company, Hammer, in fact, it was a very early Hammer production, The Mystery of the Mary Celeste. They borrowed people like Bela Lugosi and obviously Karloff for The Ghoul. Um, so you had these kind of bits and pieces. But in terms of physical horror films in this country, we weren't really known for that. Like I said, till the sort of mid-50s, really.
Yeah, yeah,
But there was things happening which we'll get into. But for my argument is, getting back to this American Gothic horror course I was doing, if you look at the 1930s horror films that might have been filmed in America, they were dominated by British talent.
yeah,
People like James Whale, Colin Clive, all these like either British actors or directors or creatives. They were dominating. So even and also the material it was based on was British. So in some ways, you had these kind of British films in Hollywood by proxy, I would argue. And I think it's interesting that a lot of those 1930s Hollywood horror films, they were based anywhere but America.
yeah, yeah.
They were in sort of weird, stupid versions of the UK or Wales or Transylvania or whatever, but it was almost like until you get to King Kong, it's almost like they were really not wanting to shine a light on America, because I guess because they're in the middle of a depression. I don't know. It's a weird sort of time. So I would argue that no, we didn't have many films that were made in this country as horror films during the 30s, but we did have a presence in Hollywood. There's no
Yeah.
getting away from the fact that Frankenstein and all those, those James Whale they are quintessentially British, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, and so yeah, that could well be the reason why Britain didn't really have a sort of horror thing going on at that time, because all of the talent that was sort of skewed towards that was in Hollywood, But I think if you look at British film from the 1890s onwards, from the very birth of cinema onwards, up to Dead of Night, really, up to 1945. There's this wealth of history that's not been covered. Part of that, as we know, is because of the unavailability of a lot of the films. That a lot of the material is lost. If it isn't lost, people tend not to want to even watch it. Oh, it's an old black and white film, or it's an old silent film. I'm not interested. But for people that are interested, there's a wealth of stuff there. And what I think there is horror in British cinema for that period of about 50 years. And if you think there's this whole 5 decades that are completely neglected by most historians, if you start with the Hammer films in the mid 50s, you're missing so much. We're doing an issue of We Belong Dead later this year, which is going to cover the period immediately before the Quatermass experiment. It's going to be the years leading up to that. So we are going to be covering a little bit of that territory. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about the period even before that, say sort of 1896, 97 through to the late 30s, early 40s. And we didn't have horror films per se in Britain, but I think what you had is people sort of dipping a little toe in the genre and doing sort of semi-horror movies. I suppose the classic example would be Alfred Hitchcock's The Lodger, in where you've got a typical Hitchcock thriller. Many people say it's the first evidence of what Hitchcock was going to become. He'd made a couple of films before, but this is the first sort of proper, what we know of as an Alfred Hitchcock thriller movie. And then you've got the sort of Ripper element to it as well, adding a touch of horror to it, which again he sort of dabbled in throughout his career without ever and up until Psycho and the Birds, never really sort of going full on. But there's this early evidence that Hitchcock had an eye on scaring an audience. There are very, very early shorts that a lot of which I love. There's some great disc releases that the BFI put out a collection of Robert Paul shorts from the 1890s and early 1900s, and there's a few horrors and fantasies on there, including a great thing called the Haunted Curiosity Shop. And another favorite primitive silent of mine is a Walter Booth film called Is Spiritualism a Fraud, which is all about it's 7 minutes long, and the first 4 minutes of the film is this incredible seance sequence, absolutely wild, with all kinds of things going on, ghosts and spectres appearing, and musical instruments floating in midair, and drums and tambourines being banged and things. And then some idiot turns the lights on, and it turns out that it's a fake seance, and they're under investigation from the authorities. And the final half of the film, the last 2 or 3 minutes, is like this mad chase sequence as they sort of uncover the charade and then chase the perpetrators down the street. But for that first 4 minutes, you're hooked. It's a horror movie, and it turns out to have this sort of Scooby-Doo revelation. But the imagery in that early part of the film, and yeah, do check this out on YouTube because it's survived and it's on there. Is Spiritualism a Fraud? I think it's got great horror imagery for a few minutes until that sort of pulling the rug out reveal. You move on to the 1920s, and the figure we're going to talk about today, we won't reveal who, you may already have guessed, but there's often debate about are they the first British horror star? Well, I'd throw in a couple of earlier names. I'd say there was a guy called Harry Agar Lyons who played Fu Manchu in about 25 or so, a couple of dozen short films in 1923 and 24. They're often termed serials. They're often called, there's supposed to be these 2 serials of Fu Manchu, but I think you can watch each episode as an individual movie. There's a great one called The Coughing Horror, which has got this brilliant ape-like monster in it. And Harry Agar Lyons played Fu Manchu in those, and he then played a character called Dr. Sin Fang in later on in the 20s and into the 1930s, who was like a sort of Fu Manchu ripoff. There's also, even prior to that, during the First World War period, sort of 1915, 16, 17, there was an actor called Aurelio Sidney, which is a fantastic name, and he played this character called Ultus, the Man from the Dead, who appeared in 4 or 5 movies during the war years. So yeah, is there an argument to say that Harry or Aurelio are the first British horror star? The only thing that possibly negates that is that even though they were making their films in England, Harry was Irish and Aurelio was Australian. So again, we're looking again to this batch of actors that you've mentioned and technicians and directors that we mentioned into the 1930s who'd all left England. They'd all been working on stage over here, but had then left for the opportunities that the new sound film in Hollywood was offering. And actor-wise, you've got people like Boris Karloff being the big one, of course. Charles Laughton, I suppose, appeared in things like Hunchback of Notre Dame, and even earlier than that, The Old Dark House for James Whale, full of British character actors, set in Wales, British technicians, British director. It's a British movie, except it wasn't filmed here. We've got people like Lionel Atwill, George Zuko, and even if you look at the Laurel and Hardy films, we've got Stan Laurel making the occasional horror or macabre film as part of that team. So so there is this argument that yes, there was British, there was English horror, but it was all happening in Hollywood. So I think you're absolutely right on that, Andrew. There are interesting little one-off films. You've mentioned The Ghoul, you've mentioned Mystery of the Mary Celeste. There was an early version, a silent version of The Ghost Train, which then got filmed with Arthur Askey later on from the Arnold Ridley play. And I don't know if you were at the screening, but this was shown at I think shown via the Broadway at the occasional screenings that they do at one of the churches in Nottingham. And I went to see the 1927 Ghost Train there, not even being aware that it had survived. I knew of the film, but I thought it was lost. And then suddenly the Broadway program it, and it's like, oh, I've got to be there. This was about 20 years ago. And there's a film called Secret of the Loch, which is an early sort of Loch Ness Monster movie, and it's one that I know Ken Russell always said he'd seen as a boy and was a big fan of, and he always used to talk about the monster in it being like a plucked chicken or something. And the director of that went on to direct one of the films that we're going to be talking about later today. And a big favourite with me as well is right at the end of the 30s, the Bolting brothers made what may have been their first film, if not certainly a very early one. And they, of course, went on to have a great career in sort of comedy and drama. But they started out doing this thing called Trunk Crime in 1939. And it's set among university students. And it's got a plot that you could almost use today. You could almost imagine a modern version of this. There's this university student who's being bullied. And he decides to take revenge on the sort of leader of the gang of the bullies, and he's got this trunk in his rooms that he realizes is big enough to fit a body in, and he decides that what he's going to do is kidnap and incapacitate the leader of these bullies, put him in the trunk, and bury him alive. And it's a really, really tense thriller, very, very gripping and exciting. It's only about an hour long, so it doesn't outstay its welcome. And it's almost completely unknown, you know, considering it's an early film of the Bolting brothers. It's a British horror movie. It's so tense. It's really well made, and yet it's not a film that people are aware of. And I think that's the case with a lot. There is a lot of hidden history of British cinema. Horror films are one area where there is this deficiency, but there are others too, you know. And I think if we think about it, we had a lot of these regional performers in light entertainment mainly, or comedy or song and dance. We got people like Gracie Fields, we've got George Formby, we've got Frank Randall, all through the 1930s and early 40s, who often didn't sell outside a particular county or a particular area, you know. And you can't imagine that the films weren't getting released in London because it was like, oh, anyone south of Derby is not going to understand these, you know. And they were made for northern audiences, and you've got studios like Mancunian Productions and so on. And so there were these little regional pockets. And I suppose, again, we look at what's happening in British cinema now, and especially if you look at the low budget end of the market, there's this explosion of low budget and no budget horror, and a lot of that's done on a regional basis. There are these little centres like Portsmouth and Kidderminster and Southend that where there's like localized production, and often the films don't escape their region, you know, and they're sort of shown to mates in the back of pubs and things. We've sort of come full circle there, but yeah, British horror is there if you look for it, but not enough people are looking for it. And as I say, at We Belong Dead, we're making our efforts to try and at least bring to people's attention some of the films of the 40s and early 50s. But what we're going to be talking about today goes back even further than that, of course.
There's a Mark Gatiss documentary in the making there. I think he'd be brilliant at doing something like that.
Yeah.
You know, in the same fold that he did his history of horror and the Euro horror. I think it'd be brilliant.
Sure, it's a great story to be told, and a lot of familiar names involved too. You know, people that audiences might have heard of. So, but you might not have heard of these particular films. And as we've said, a lot of the real big talent just up sticks and went over to Hollywood anyway and sort of made their horror films there. But again, the whole history of horror and its portrayal on British screens is fascinating. And when you've got periods of censorship, very, very heavy censorship, and of course we lived through this in the 80s with the video nasties thing, but the equivalent of that was this ban on horror in the 1930s, which I think went even further than the video nasties, because there was simply no way, there was no network by which you could get to see these films. And that was different for us in 1984 and 85. At least if you knew the right people, or you made trips to Amsterdam or whatever, you could get hold of these banned films. For audiences in the 1930s, in that period 36, 37, 38 that we mentioned, it was just, no, you can't see these. And they didn't see them.
Well, I mean, I don't want to necessarily go into this because it's a long story in itself, but we had, we were one of the first countries to have that sort of censorship. I mean, America, I mean, you talk about the pre-code stuff in America, and in 1934 they got much stricter, but we'd had censorship. And what people forget, what it was the British, now it's a British Board of Film Classification, but when it was first introduced, the British Board of Film Censorship, and that was introduced in 1912 after some hoo-ha with when they tried to portray Christ on screen and all, from the mate, what's the name of I forget the name of the film now. Anyway, it's this. It was, the church didn't have a problem with it, but the Daily Mail did. So same old story. So we ended up.
It is, isn't that always the way and continues to be? Anyway, I've mentioned this period 36, 37, 38, 39, where there's this ban on British horror. Is this a time to talk about the people that challenged that? And this little knot of people, this little group of people that said, okay, you're banning horror films, you're not going to stop us. So time maybe to move on to our subject for today.
Yes, we are. Like I said, we normally look at a particular film, but this is like a special episode. So we're gonna look at a particular figure from British horror, who, who in some ways is not particularly well known to the sort of people outside of the horror circles and things like that. But we are going to look at Mr. Murder himself, Tod Slaughter.
It's a Toddcast, folks.
It is a Toddcast.
I'll soon polish you off. Trade slack. Not a single customer today. I pine for something exciting to happen. So I'll just put a beautiful edge on my beautiful razor in case someone happens to come in.
Oh, Darrell, when did you first come across Mr. Slaughter then?
Like a lot of people of my generation, it will have been in Dennis Gifford's Pictorial History of Horror Movies. Now, Dennis didn't write an awful lot on Tod, but on page 204, I think it is, you can tell I've looked this up this morning, he does like a whole column on Tod, and he sort of runs through his horror films. He mentions about 10 films, and he tells you which characters Tod played in them. And then at the end, he says, Tod could have been the great British monster. And this is Gifford writing in 1973, remember. He says he could have been the great British monster, and also says by now, so again, by 1973, he should be ripe for rediscovery. And there's one photograph of Tod, there's one still in the book, a still from Crimes at the Dark House. There's this column written by Dennis Gifford, and for many, many years, that's all those English fans had to go on. There were probably people still around in 1973 that had seen Tod Slaughter's films, and certainly people that would have seen him on stage or heard him on the radio, because he was a Renaissance man. He was a master of all media. But even the people that may have seen him or seen the films had probably forgotten him by now, or had probably dismissed him as all those terrible old B movies, what a waste of time sort of thing. And Gifford was the first British writer for a while to sort of cite Tod potentially as a British horror star of all of our own, the one who didn't go to Hollywood. And I'd like to think chose not to. I'd like to think that he and his director and producer George King and this little knot of people they had around them were some kind of defiant mob. You know, I'd love. I'm sure none of this is true, but I look at them as being, we're British and we're staying here and we're going to defy the British censors and we're going to do what we want. And that's my sort of rather romantic sort of view of this little, very brief period in which they churned out these films, which have recently been released on an excellent box set by Indicator.
Oh, what a beautiful knife. That's the knife that Mrs. Lovett used in her pie shop before I polished her off.
We had the new channel in Britain, Channel 4 on TV, very, very exciting in its early days, as we all remember. And one of the great things they did, brilliant for horror fans, was they'd show a lot of vintage horror movies late at night. And I remember they put on a series of the Boris Karloff Mad Doctor films from the early 40s, when he'd sort of left Universal and was working at other major studios, but doing these sort of hour-long mad scientist films. And Channel 4 showed all of those. And then, having run out of those, their programmer obviously thought, well, what's next? And dug through the vaults and realised, oh, there's all these films directed by George King and starring Tod Slaughter. Let's bung those on, you know. And I think for me and for many, many fans of our generation, this was a revelation. You know, we'd read about Tod in Dennis Gifford's book and one or two other places, but suddenly here was a chance to see the films, you know, and then it was like one a week for a couple of months, and it was great. It was a little crash course in this whole area, precisely what we've been talking about, of this sort of lost portion of British cinema. And suddenly it was being revealed to us, and it was fantastic. And as we go on to talk about the films later, the thing that we realized watching these films week after week was it's essentially the same movie, because it's pretty much repeated time after time after time. And he might have a different name, or he might wear whiskers in one film and be clean shaven in another. He might have a French accent in one. He might sort of die in one movie or go to prison in another or something. But essentially, we're watching the same 65 minutes over and over again. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's not boring at all. There's a fascination and a delight and a thrill and a drama in knowing that you're going to be watching this stuff and seeing the same plot being trotted out. And it's very interesting seeing how George King and the other filmmakers deal with that, the variations that they bring to it. Also, the fact that they claim it as well. It's not just about the variations, it's the fact that they dare to say, no, we are going to sell you the same film all over again with the names changed. And you're going to love it. You're going to love seeing it over and over again. And we do. I don't know how. You're not bored by these films. You get to the 8th movie, and rather than rolling your eyes, you get to the Crimes at the Dark House in 1940. Rather than rolling your eyes and thinking, oh, not this again, you're cheering Tod on, you know. And it really does achieve what he must have achieved on stage. He must have had this following on stage with audiences turning up because they knew what they were going to see. And I think that's the case with these films.
What do you do in your spare time, Mr. Slaughter? I spend my spare time evolving new methods of murder. I've tried them all. Why, from this very seat, I sent hundreds to their death. Don't be afraid of a little drop of blood, sir. The ceiling leaks. You'll get used to that in time.
So, I mean, Tod, he actually became known as Tod. It wasn't his real name, obviously, because and the story goes that it was his sister couldn't pronounce his actual real name, so she ended up christening him Tod, and it kind of stuck from there. But it absolutely fits. And also, you know, Slaughter as well.
Hard to believe that's his real name. It sounds so much. I mean, and Tod, of course, means death in German. So you've got Death Slaughter is your actor's name, and it's real to a point, you know. And I suppose Max Schreck would be the equivalent in Germany. You know, again, these extraordinary people who get involved in horror movies and come equipped with the names for it. You know, and it's almost like it was meant to happen.
Well, yeah, and also I might humbly suggest Andrew Graves.
Indeed. Why not? Why not?
Yeah, so I mean, he was even though he came to prominence in terms of cinema in the 30s, um, really he was a product of the sort of late 19th century, and obviously, and he came from Newcastle, but that fairly early on in his life, he decided he wanted to go on stage, which wasn't he wasn't and whereas we might get maybe youngsters now that are go to sort of college or whatever to study theatre and get lots of support from their parents, which is great. There certainly wasn't the case with Tod Slaughter. It was very much looked down upon. I don't think he had any support from his family, or certainly not his parents, definitely not his dad. So it was a case of, but bless him, it was a case of him wanting to do that, coming from this kind of more, regional sort of background. He certainly wasn't from London or anything like that, and working his way onto stage, and then within fairly short space of time, he was managing his own troupe of performers and sort of going around the country once he'd found his kind of shtick, if you like, and reproducing these what were known as melodramas. And I think it's an important distinction that, wasn't really till the 50s and 60s that the sort of the in terms of what presented on stage started changing. You tend to get these kind of angry young men and these kitchen sink dramas. But for a long time it was, melodrama was that ruled, in theatre. And I think it's kind of a lot of people kind of look down their nose at it now. But, as Tod Slaughter himself said, you might call it melodrama. I just call it drama.
Yeah, yeah.
This is what we do. This is what it's all about. And he was perfect. And what the other thing I love about Tod Slaughter is, apart from everything else we'll get into, is the way he looked. When he started making films, he was well into his 50s. So he had this kind of the and what I love about it is that if you think about Lon Chaney and you think of the makeup, he'd put wire clips into his eyes to give him, particularly in London After Midnight and Phantom of the Opera, to give him this kind of strange. Tod Slaughter had that anyway. He
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
need a lick of
He looked
makeup.
like
That's what
that.
he looked
Yeah,
like.
yeah.
I mean, bless him.
They all often people use this phrase "moon faced" about him, and it absolutely captures what he was. Um, there was on the recent Indicator box set. There's a great commentary done on one of the films by David McGillivray and Kim Newman, and they discuss at one point, if you did a Tod Slaughter biopic sort of today, who would be good to play him? And I'd thought about this over the years, actually, and I'd always thought, well, Jim Broadbent might be good as Tod in a movie. But as time passed, I thought maybe Jim, it would be a bit too old to play that part now. And that McGillivray and Newman actually name him on their commentary and say, oh, yeah, we think Jim Broadbent would be perfect to play Tod. And I was thinking, well, yeah, maybe 20 years ago, but I'm not so sure now. That set me thinking, who has got that sort of moon-faced look, and who is at the right sort of age, and who do I think could capture the spirit of Tod Slaughter in a movie? And I came up with two names. I thought Hugh Bonneville or possibly Colin Firth, and I think they might be two guys that could really go for it and would love to play Tod. But he was a real one-off. It's so difficult to sort of put other people into his shoes. He was a total original. He made himself what he was. Other people had performed on stage in these sort of melodramas, but he really took that by the scruff of the neck and made it his own. And of course, he started out playing, when he was younger, he was doing the melodramas, but he was playing a sort of minor member of the cast and basically managing the company. But he'd come on and be like third or fourth on the bill in the acting role, and another actor who he would see as more suitable would play the villain. By the time it came to making the movies, he, as you've said, he was of the age where he was now playing the villains on stage, and so there was no question that anybody else was going to get a look in when it came to taking the lead roles in the films. And again, they're so much better for that, because as I've said, I think we don't need to really discuss the individual films one by one. I think we can discuss them as a lump, because effectively, as we've said, it's pretty much the same movie.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to the movies in a second, but I think what fascinating, it's not just Tod Slaughter, but I love, even I've never been part of it, and I've always only kind of read about it and seen it as an outsider, but it fascinates me, is that idea of British rep. This idea of, touring repertory theatres, basically going round the country, going out to provinces or going out to the regions to perform the same handful of plays over and over again. And I'm sure that as a performer, obviously you weren't paid very much, but also, it would have been quite monotonous in some ways. And I'm sure there were massive downsides to it. But from an outsider, I've always been in love with that idea.
It's almost like a gypsy lifestyle, isn't it? And I think Tod had the best of both worlds in his company, because he was one of these old-fashioned, what they used to call actor managers, who would sort of oversee the entire company, and he'd deal with all the finances and everything, and he'd arrange bookings for all the theatres. But then he'd come on and act as well, as part of the troupe, and eventually became the major part of the troupe and started putting himself in the lead parts. But it's good that he didn't do that initially. It's good that he felt, okay, I'm in charge. But in terms of acting, there's a better man to play the monster, to play the lead villain, and it was only with age that he sort of thought, well, I'm now aging into those parts. But him and his troupe had the best of both worlds, in that they did the touring around the UK, which was great for provincial audiences, but they also had their base in the Elephant and Castle in London, where they actually had a theatre and a presence there. And as you've said, their shows would attract the sort of general working class audiences, but the Elephant and Castle apparently was a beacon for the upper classes. They would go quite often. Lords and ladies would be fighting to get tickets for Tod shows in London, and there are even stories that they'd obviously, if you're lord somebody, and you want to slum it in a theatre for a night, you're going to contact them and say, can we have the best seats in the house? And occasionally they'd gone. They'd say, oh, can we have a box for the evening? And Tod or whoever was in charge would say, I'm sorry, they're all sold, And they were so desperate to see these shows. There are tales of bigwigs coming from the House of Lords and maybe minor royalty and things like that, saying, well, I've got to get a seat for Maria Marten or Sweeney Todd or whatever the show is. And if I can't sit up in the Guards, I can't sit in a private box or anything, I'll sit in row B next to some just an ordinary everyday person, someone who's just done a shift in a factory or something. They were so desperate to see these shows. This is how popular they were, and it's no wonder that with cinema beginning to sort of burgeon and develop in Britain, that the idea to film these things would eventually happen. And of course, what happens with the early films, as people who've seen the box set will now know, is that they do that sort of transition from stage to movie, because a couple of the early films have these, the very first one, Maria Marten, actually starts with the cast walking out on stage and being introduced, and then turns into a movie. And there are other films that do similar sort of conceits, as though, right, film is so young and so new, or certainly sound film is, that and this whole and horror is something that we're trying to sort of siphon in and just sort of sidle in under the nose of the censors, that we've got to be sort of careful about what we do. So we're going to keep the links with the theatre going and sort of almost pretend that you're coming to the theatre rather than going to a movie. They're extraordinary films in that sense, and I love that they actually straddle the divide between the two media.
Well, I mean, if we look at something like Maria Marten or The Murder in the Red Barn, I mean that I did I mean, I'd heard of Tod Slaughter and I was kind of aware of Tod Slaughter, but then I did a degree in creative writing at a university in Nottingham, and the one of the things we looked at, there was a module where we looked at theatre and it went through the kind of history of theatre, and one of the things we talked about was, or that was covered was, you know, theatre adaptations of Maria Marten, and obviously it's
Yeah,
based on a true story and stuff.
yeah,
But you know, obviously that I mean the film obviously it's based on this kind of true story and itself based on a theatrical performance, as was kind of Frankenstein and Dracula in the States, you know. But I think what shocked me about when I first saw it, you know, sat down to watch the Tod Slaughter version, is obviously they don't show anything. There's nothing explicit there, but you're under no illusion of what this is about. This is someone who's been raped and got pregnant, you know,
yeah, yeah,
and then he's done away with. It's, you know, it's pretty shocking stuff,
yeah.
really.
And this happens throughout the films as well, because the third film they made, The Crimes of Stephen Hawke,
Yeah.
has Tod playing a character called the Spine Breaker, which is that's an even better name than Tod Slaughter, the Spine Breaker. And he lives up to his word in the first 2 minutes of the film, not only by breaking somebody's spine, but it's the spine of a little kid. It's this annoying little child who comes on, and he's a posh kid, which must have appealed mightily to people in the audience who were willing Tod to murder this child. You know, he's this really annoying little brat, and he's sort of saying, "Oh, you know, remove yourself from our property. What are you doing here? You horrible man." You know, and Tod's. In this particular case, he doesn't actually sort of look at the audience, but there were cases in other films where he might do, and certainly on stage he would do. Um, but he knows that we know what's coming, and again, there's this great joy in it, you know. And you wonder, is this a way that they managed to sidestep the horror hating censors by making the horror fun, you know, by bringing the audience in on the gag sort of thing. And that child murder in Crimes of Stephen Hawke is absolutely shocking. It's done off screen, of course, again, but again, as you've just remarked, Andrew, we know in all of these scenes and in all of these sort of censorious times that they were being made in, George King and Tod Slaughter knew what to show and what not to show, and they knew what we would need to see in order to get the idea of what it was that we were missing. And yeah, this kid gets his spine snapped in half. We don't see it, but we know it's happened. We see the sort of lead up to it. We see the aftermath of it, and we're on Tod's side as it all happens. It's absolutely amazing. And I wonder if the censors watched this and thought, "Hey, we're on this guy. We want this kid to die as well," you know. And that was some means of how these films might have snuck through. I really don't know, but yeah, it's astonishing what they got away with in those movies. And they knew what they could show, they knew what they couldn't show, but they definitely knew what they could imply and what they could get away with.
Well, I mean, people kind of, you know, they tend to, you know, I think it's getting a resurgence now, but I think people were definitely at the time, because his films were very sort of, they had very mixed reviews, you know, you know, they weren't exactly universally lauded. They were popular, but, you know, critically they weren't.
Yeah.
But I think people do kind of, they are sniffy about this idea of melodrama, and you know, it is seen as being the poor relation to more sophisticated. My you know, I'm with Tod on this. I think, you know, if you look, because and again, another thing I've recently done at the Broadway is I've done a series of talks on American crime films. And obviously, so we spent a long time talking about 40s stuff and film noir productions. What is film noir if not over the top melodrama? I mean,
Yeah, indeed.
people
Yeah,
forget, you know, obviously because it looks really cool and it's brilliant, you know, a lot of those films look immaculate. And
yeah,
a lot of those films have got this brilliant, witty, Chandler-esque sort of, or Dashiell Hammett sort of dialogue type stuff. But you forget when you strip it down, it's ridiculous. It absolutely most of those films are ridiculous. One of the because if you look at something, Postman Always Rings Twice, it's stupid. I love it.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely love it. It looks brilliant. It's great. But if you think about it logically for 1 second, it's stupid. It makes no
Yeah,
sense. It's
it is,
absolutely.
and in that sense, it is a melodrama in the style of the stuff that Todd was doing and that other people had been doing on stage and in these movies that we're talking about. You compare the plots of a classic noir, something like Postman Always Rings Twice or Double Indemnity, to the plot of a Tod Slaughter movie, and it's the same sort of machinations that the characters are going through. It's often about money or it's about sex. The drive is to, I must have this girl, or I must have this guy, or I must have this £1,000,000 that I know my relatives have stashed away in the bank. And these are the core plots of some of the great noirs, but they're also the core plots of Tod Slaughter films. And I suppose the noir also developed in a way from a sort of the two dominant populist genres in America in the 30s, other than the musical film, the Busby Berkeley film, I suppose, were gangster films and horror films. And you sort of mash the gangster and the horror film together, and noir is the child that comes out, and that's exactly how it worked, and so there is always a sense of within the best noirs, there's always a sense of horror in there as well. There is a little core of horror, I think, in there. And as you say, the break the plots down, write them down on the back of an envelope and say, this happens, this happens, this happens. Anyone reading that would think, that's absurd. Nobody would go along with that. Nobody would fall for that. That would never happen. But then you watch Double Indemnity or you watch The Big Sleep or whatever, and you're hooked. You're thinking, yeah, the way this is being portrayed, I do believe it. And I think that's the case in Todd's films as well. And a lot of that's down to his sort of lusty performances, his broad performances, but also the little subtle things that he could do. Little hand movements, very sort of balletic, very light on his feet, very much like Oliver Hardy or Charles Lawton in that sense, and sharing all of this with the audience. There are these winks to the audience, but they're not always broad winks. He could do that. He could do the sort of nod to the audience and the leer and the laugh, but he could also communicate with the audience. And I mean the cinema audience here. I mean coming through the screen with a little gesture or a little nod or flicker of the eyes or something. He didn't always need to go big. And it's great when he does go big, but you watch those films again and you'll see what a great actor Todd is and what a good screen actor he is. And I think the thing that, as well as the plots, I think the thing that he shares with the great noir characters is this sense of connection with the audience and getting the audience to go along with you. A lot of the time he's playing con men, and it's almost as though Todd himself is the con man who's bringing you, the viewer, into this film and getting you on his side, And I've done comparisons with other people, and maybe we'll talk a bit about Todd's legacy later on. But one screen character that I think Todd may well have influenced, and it's not a villainous character. It's a good and funny comic character. I think it's Phil Silver's Sergeant Bilko in the Phil Silver show in the 1950s. Who, again, if you break down those plots and you look at what Bilko's doing, he's not out to kill anyone or anything. He's not out to commit violence, but he's out to make money. He's out to get the girl, he's out to do all these things. And he's so selfish, he'll pretend that he's doing things for the greater good and for the good of his platoon and for the good of the army base and everything. But at heart, and we're totally along with him on this. We're in there with him, and yeah, do this. I hope your plot succeeds, And of course, like Todd, it never does. It always unravels in the second half of the show, and it's watching that unraveling that I think is the great thing with these characters, and this is wonderful with Todd. You do get this formula where he's set up as like the evil squire, the evil villain, the evil backbreaker. We see he's got his gun, which in classic fashion we know is going to come out at the end with its traditional one bullet in it. Great sort of Todd trope, and but we then see him starting to scheme, and we get the idea of, oh yeah, there's a fortune buried somewhere, or he's in love with this girl or whatever. And there's your sort of MacGuffin right there, your Hitchcockian MacGuffin. And then it's the plot set in motion, the wheels are set in motion. How is he going to approach getting these goods, whatever it is? Who does he have to kill to get those? Who does he have to con to get those? And it's very much like film noir. It's very much like Bilko later on. And then halfway through, he starts getting found out, and he has to start juggling balls in the air and covering his tracks and so on, maybe killing a few people that he didn't want to kill in order to cover tracks. And part of the fun of the second half of a Tod Slaughter film, and of the second half of a film noir, and of the second half of an episode of Sergeant Bilko, is seeing everything fall to pieces. And how is our star going to deal with that? It's wonderful. And yeah, so I think there are more to these films than just melodrama, and more to them than just the core of horror, the core of the fact that he's out there murdering and slaughtering people. There's a lot more going on, and as you say, it has these tendrils which reach out into the future of film and television.
Well, I think that, when they released the Indicator set, I had it as a Christmas present because I've been wanting it for a while. And I remember, obviously quite a few people had it around the same time. And I remember seeing lots of posts online, and a lot of the posts were kind of like, oh, well, I've got this. And then other people were commenting saying, oh, well, and it was almost like taking the piss, you know what I mean? And it was almost well, yeah, I was thinking about getting this because they look hilarious. And whatever you think about it, okay, but that's so insulting because I think there is this misconception that these were just like, oh, we've got these stage productions, let's do the stage show and let's point a camera at it, and that's you've got this artifice in a few of the films where you do this transition, as you mentioned, from stage to screen. But these are beautifully filmed. They are, these are skilled people involved.
Once you get into the proper film portion, they're properly cinematic. And you're working at that time, of course, with an Academy frame. You've got your 4:3 frame. So there's not an awful lot you can do with that. But you look at the way the sets are built and the way that George King and David McDonald filmed them, they're fantastic, and even better in these new transfers where you can really get the full feel of that. And they make these films very cinematic while giving Tod a stage on which to strut his stuff, and he's maybe not a great film actor, although, as I say, I think he has got these little nuances which you might compare with a Charles Lawton or an Oliver Hardy or someone. He's comfortable with the camera, even though he's giving a stage performance, but he lets the director and he lets the crew get on with their job, and they, I think, are the people who make the film cinematic.
Absolutely. And I think, he could do this. He was a brilliant performer. That's the point, whether he could go on and star in a David Lean film, obviously that's questionable, but what he did. And I've made this point before. If you think about someone like, I don't know, John Wayne, whatever you think about John Wayne personally, he was a great screen presence. Personally, whatever he was up to in his personal, I have massive problems with what he was about in his personal life. But on screen, I don't want John Wayne to be anything other than John Wayne.
No, he's got this one character, but he plays it brilliantly. He brings variance to it across films where he needs to, but you always know you're going to come back to the core, the rock, and in a film like The Searchers, for instance, he almost plays him as a horror character. He's gradually going mad over the course of the film, and he's not the hero of that film, even though he's set up as the hero. There isn't a hero in that movie, and it's a horror film in that sense, and again, it's got kinship with Tod Slaughter. It really does, because we see Tod, we're sort of on Tod's side when the fun of the plot is being developed, and we're thinking, oh great, he's going to go and get the bag of money, or he's going to get the damsel, we're sort of in there with him. But then as it all starts falling to pieces, we're also enjoying the fact that he's failing, that he's descending into madness, and it's very similar to the way that you watch John Wayne in The Searchers, I think. But yeah, the comparison you've made there, the more direct comparison you've made with a figure like John Wayne, is a very good one, because essentially what we are getting is an actor who knows his own limitations, works within those limitations, but makes something out of that and makes a career out of it. It is possible to do that without being boring, without the audience thinking, oh no, I'm just watching the same thing over and over again. It's getting the audience to say, right, I'm watching the same thing over and over again, and I like it.
There's massive room for that. I think that it's this, this more amateurish criticism of things like that is that, oh, well, this person's got no range. I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
You've got someone like, say, take someone like Toni Collette. Toni Collette, that lass has got range. She is amazing. Stick her in anything, I forget it's Toni Collette. She's just brilliant. That's great. But I don't want that in everybody.
No.
Some people to just be I want Tod Slaughter to be fucking Tod Slaughter.
Oh yeah,
That's
a good comparison here for someone like Tod, or a John Wayne like character, or any actor that gets into a rut like this but makes something of it, is, I think, not to compare them to other actors who might be more versatile. Maybe compare them to a great sportsman or something, a great cricketer or a great footballer or someone. You go along and you watch your favourite football players because you're going to get the same thing from them every week. There's going to be the midfield powerhouse whose energy sort of propels the team, and who plays the same type of pass every week to the same other players every week. And you love that when you're watching 90 minutes of football and you see a great player do that. You know exactly what you're going to get, but you're there for that reason. And I think that's the case with someone like Tod Slaughter in film. He's almost like the midfield general of the movies. It's exactly what you're going to get, but you're appreciating that very thing.
Yeah, I mean, also with the films, I mean, obviously people, I'm not the first to say this, but if one of the last ones I watched was It's Never Too Late to Mend. I mean, you've got the heightened melodrama. Obviously, he's an over-the-top character, and yet you've still got this brilliant social commentary in there as well.
Yeah.
And
which happens in a few of the films.
Yeah, it does. And I think this is the other connection with something like Hammer and a lot of those British horror films that came later. Is that you could, and I've said this before, I'm not saying Hammer as a studio were political in their intent. However, there's a lot of films that came out of Hammer you could read and interpret.
Yeah, it's underlying.
As a commentary on the class system. It's not it's not an accident that Dracula is an aristocrat or the Baron is an aristocrat that comes to a sticky end. And I think that's what we've got in Tod Slaughter films.
Sure. I was in preparing for the talk today. I was sort of mulling over Tod's career and what might have been different about it and what might have happened that didn't happen. One thought that I had, don't you think he would have made a great Baron Frankenstein had it come to it? And playing it you can imagine Frankenstein being played very much in the Tod Slaughter mold. He'd have come on, he'd have given exactly the same performance that he gives in Sweeney Todd.
Well, there's in an alternative universe, we might have had Tod Slaughter as the Baron, and as is known by a lot of people, Bernard Bresslaw was up to playing the creature before Christopher.
Yeah, well,
that's a double bill.
Yeah. One ticket from this customer, please. Yeah, I'm right there. So and I mean, as it's been pointed out again on the Indicator box set, there are scenes in the Tod Slaughter movies and Bernard Robinson indeed worked on these films before moving on to Hammer. So you can see some of that early Hammer style production design, and you can see the roots of Hammer in the George King films.
And Gilling as well, wasn't he?
Indeed, yeah. And then there are actual plot points like the famous conceit from Curse of Frankenstein, where the Baron is engaged to a sort of upper class lady played by Hazel Court, but he's also shagging the maid. He's shagging the parlour maid. And then when she starts making overtures that,
Yes.
oh, I'm going to tell everyone, he has her killed by the monster. And that's lifted from one of the Tod Slaughter movies, almost shot for shot, scene for scene, play for play, you know. And so, yeah, Hammer, I think, is one place that had obviously paid attention to the George King films and the Tod Slaughter films.
Yeah, pass the marmalade.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Can you imagine Todd saying that line? You know, I don't think he'd have given it quite the subtlety of Peter Cushing, but it would have been damn good to listen to. Um, I mean, in terms of influence, I think Stephen Thrower does a great piece on the Indicator box set, and he cites, he talks about Dick Dastardly as being from Wacky Racers as being a Tod Slaughter for the 1960s and 1970s. He talks about the Master in Doctor Who, as played particularly by Roger Delgado and Anthony Ainley, as being effectively Tod Slaughter in a new guise, you know.
What, Terry Thomas as well.
Indeed, yeah, exactly. Well, he's very much like the sort of Sergeant Bilko type character. He's taking this character and finding the fun in it and finding the comedy in it. And again, yeah, you can imagine Todd in all those great characters that Terry Thomas played in the big blockbusters of the 60s, you know, all the sort of Great Race and Magnificent Men type movies. You can imagine Todd in those parts, can't you? You really can.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, because blimey, we're running out of time again. Now then, Darrell, obviously you're based in Derby. Now you said to me yesterday that there are strong connections between Tod Slaughter and Derby. So do you want to fill us in on that?
I'm gonna quickly run through this. Yeah, in the time we've got left, Todd died in Derby. He died in 1956. He was still working. He performed at the Hippodrome Theatre, which is still standing in Derby. And I do a walk around Derby where I show some of these locations. Todd performed in a cut down version of Maria Marten as part of a variety show. He did 20 minutes. The audience loved it. And he was staying at a pub called the Scarsdale Arms, which is down Macklin Street, if you know Derby. And he was found dead by the landlord's son that morning in, I think, February 1956. The story then goes on that Michael Klinger of Compton Teckley Films, which then became Tygon Films, Tony Tenter's partner, Michael Klinger, later the producer of things like Get Carter, had a cinema built in Derby called the Super Armour, and plan was to have a chain of these Super Armour deluxe cinemas all around the country. I think there was only two built in the end, one in Derby, one in Birmingham. But Michael Klinger was the owner of this cinema, and it was said to be haunted by a ghost, which the usherettes and all the staff started to call Fred, and this ghost entered sort of local Derby legend. Oh, we've seen Fred the ghost again, you know. And then local historians started putting two and two together and saying, well, that cinema's been built on the old site of the Scarsdale Arms. It's where Tod Slaughter died. Is it Todd haunting the cinema, you know? And the cinema eventually failed after about 10 years, and it got turned into a disco. And the ghost was never seen once the disco started up. And there are two sort of possible theories here. One is that Tod Slaughter hated disco music and vanished. It's like, I'm not having this, you know, this terrible beat music. You know, as a disco fan, I'd love to think that Todd had been waiting for this music all of his afterlife and finally thought, well, disco's arrived, my work here is done, you know. Interestingly, on that very site at this very moment, a new entertainment complex is being constructed. A 3,500 seat arena on the very site where Tod Slaughter died. And I would love to think that the ghost is going to come back next year.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. Well.
So look at if you're in the Beckett-Well Arena or whatever it's going to be called, watching Frankie Boyle or whoever's going to be on there, you know, be careful, listen to a cackle behind you. There could be a tap on the shoulder, you know. Yeah, it could be.
Wow. well, this has been absolutely fascinating. We could go on all day. Unfortunately,
Indeed, there's
I've got other
loads more
stuff
to
to
say.
do.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it just remains for me to. Oh, thanks, Darrell. Thanks for coming on again. You'll have to come on
Always a
again
pleasure,
another
Andrew.
time. It's been absolutely brilliant. You're such a vast repository of knowledge. It's always lovely talking to you.
Well, I think we make a good team in that respect. So
But thanks a lot, Darrell.
my pleasure.
Yeah. It just remains for me to say, remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.